Folks, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Such a pleasure having you all here today. Welcome to Tales of Cloud Compromise, Real Incidents, Real Learnings. Let's kick off with a quick intro. My name is Omar, ElAhdan.
Hey everyone, my name is Silverstone.
And we're both part of the Mandiant Security Transformation Services team, where we spend about 50% of our time performing incident response remediation, which entails that we go in to contain, posture, and eradicate threat actors from on-prem and cloud environments during cyber incidents. The other 50% of our time, we spend it performing proactive engagements, such as cloud and on-prem security assessments.
So we'll get into kind of a high-level agenda of what we'll cover off on here today. We'll break the session into kind of 3 areas of focus that we're seeing attackers take advantage of as it relates to cloud compromise. And for each of those, we'll kind of anchor around some incident response case studies and examples that our team has responded to. And then we'll go into some technical and tactical takeaways and recommendations that hopefully teams can use to help secure their environment. So we'll use this stat to kind of set the stage, given that when we talk about cloud compromise, we don't want to just talk about cloud in isolation. So 99% of organizations are running some sort of hybrid infrastructure, being cloud and on-prem. At the same time, 63% of organizations are using either exactly the same or most of the same approach for protecting their cloud environment as they are for on-prem. And so that's kind of how we want to focus the session here today, in that we don't want to just treat cloud security in a silo, but we don't want to just lift and shift, copy and paste our security approach from on-prem to cloud. And so our security approach, when we think about protecting against cloud compromise, should account for the fact that lines between on-premise and cloud are blurred and overlapping and interconnected, that there's an increasing importance of protecting identities, in that identities are kind of that security boundary for cloud environments, and that there's an extended attack surface that includes cloud and includes on-prem and kind of everything in between.
We wanted to bring the frontline experience of how we see threat actors abuse and compromise cloud environments. In summary, we broke it down into 3 main pillars or themes. Pillar 1, understanding your hybrid architecture. Throughout that pillar, we'll touch on how threat actors abuse hybrid integrations and connectivity to gain access to cloud environments. Pillar number 2, securing your identities, where we'll cover and touch on common threat actor exploits around weak identity controls. And we'll also touch on common overlooked aspects to both identity as well as multi-factor authentication. And lastly, we'll talk through reducing your attack surface. And in that pillar, we'll touch on why we need to change the narrative to look at our attack surface, not just from a network perspective, but also to encompass identity. More to come on that. Throughout all 3 pillars, we'll touch on the importance of effective logging, detection, and response. We'll go through and mention case studies, we'll go through IR examples, and I want to spend 30 seconds to give an overview of how we at Mandiant track and categorize threat actors. We break them down and put them in one of 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is APT, which stands for Advanced Persistent Threat Actors. Those are nation-state sponsored threat actors and oftentimes highly technical in nature. Bucket 2, FIN, or Financially Motivated Threat Actors. Those are threat actors with financial motives. And bucket 3 is uncategorized, meaning those are threat actors that we're tracking, but they still haven't graduated to either FIN or APT. It's a very long and complex process to graduate threat actors. Throughout this session, we'll reference threat actors by saying TA. Lastly, before we dig into our first pillar, we'll go through case studies and IR examples. We modified some of the facts to protect our clients as well as individuals associated with our clients. And with that, I'll hand it over to Will to cover our first pillar, understanding your hybrid architecture.
Awesome. Cool. So we'll get into the first area of focus here around hybrid architecture. And so we'll start off with some common challenges in context of kind of protecting that hybrid environment. And so, starting off on misconfiguring tier 0 within cloud environments. And so what we mean by this is on our incident response engagements, on our proactive assessments, we're seeing our organizations deploying that kind of tier 0 critical infrastructure within their cloud environments. Think Active Directory domain controllers, PKI servers, PAM servers within their cloud. And so when you deploy that critical infrastructure that can control your on-premise environment into your cloud environment, the security of your on-premise and the security of your cloud environments are now tied to one another. And so a misconfiguration in the cloud can endanger the security of your on-premise environment, and vice versa. A compromise on-prem can lead to a compromise in the cloud. And so that kind of gets into the second point around accounting for privilege escalation and lateral movement between each environment, in that an attacker compromising one environment can use that to move into the other environment. And then lastly, making sure that we're accounting for the control plane versus the data plane as it relates to cloud environments. And so what we mean by this is specifically for cloud, control plane being the administrative function, the console, the APIs to create, update, delete resources. The data plane being kind of the running infrastructure itself, a running process on a VM, a local admin on a database, something like that. And so as security teams, deploying that infrastructure within cloud environments, we need to think about protecting access, protecting data at both the control plane and the data plane. And so we'll get into an example of that. So this is kind of a typical cloud resource hierarchy. You have GCP folders, you have Azure management groups, you have AWS organizations. Within that, projects, subscriptions, accounts, and then within that, you have the infrastructure itself. And so what we're seeing is organizations deploying domain controllers, PKI servers, that tier 0 infrastructure down here, without necessarily thinking about what permissions or security controls have been applied at higher levels within that hierarchy. An example within GCP would be a domain controller running as a virtual machine within a specific project. And if you have a cloud administrator account that's assigned the compute instance admin role within that project or within a folder that's inherited down, that cloud administrator now has the ability to reset passwords on that domain controller, create local administrator accounts on that domain controller. So if that cloud administrator account is compromised, there's a clear path to be able to compromise the on-premise environment as well. So that would be kind of a way for an attacker to take advantage of the control plane versus data plane in a cloud environment to move through on-prem. Next, we'll get into our first incident response case study here that kind of shows the reverse, where we had an on-premise compromise that ended up leading to ransomware within the cloud. And so what we saw here was, starting off, an attacker was able to exploit an exchange vulnerability and exfiltrate emails from the on-premise exchange. And they actually ended up selling those emails to a second threat group who was then able to use that to craft kind of highly targeted phishing campaigns against users. And because those emails were coming from, the data was coming from emails from within the organization, a number of users ended up falling for those phishing campaigns. The attacker was able to compromise a series of administrator accounts, get onto the network, move laterally to a domain controller. From there, they had access to deploy a group policy object, GPO, to deploy ransomware across the domain. And for this specific organization, they had virtual machines running in their cloud environment that were domain joined. And so there was nothing stopping the ransomware deployment from spreading from the on-premise environment into the cloud environment. And so when we think about kind of ransomware in the cloud, this is one of the more common models in terms of an on-premise compromise leading to compromise within the cloud. So we'll get into some takeaways from this. Two pieces to that, kind of the securing tier 0 infrastructure and properly segmenting cloud and on-prem. So first off, like we talked about, considering that permissions inheritance, considering the inheritance of security controls, and kind of having the full inventory and picture of who has access to what at each level within that cloud hierarchy. And so one way to control that would be, around the second bullet, to deploy that kind of critical infrastructure within a dedicated management group within Azure, a dedicated GCP folder, to kind of reduce what would get inherited down within and kind of isolate those components. And so if you're using something like a tiering model on-premise within, say, Active Directory, making sure that's also reflected within your cloud environment as well, be it stricter access controls or more granular logging, stuff like that. The second point around properly segmenting on-prem and cloud, really the main takeaway here is traditional security best practices from on-premise environments still apply within the cloud. Limiting outbound connections from virtual machines, using security groups within AWS, GCP firewall, things like that. And then the last point around that privilege escalation lateral movement. And so really understanding if you're responsible for securing a cloud environment, inventorying and understanding what are those weaknesses within on-prem that can then lead to compromise within my cloud environment. And then last kind of takeaway with this section would be logging and detection priorities. Starting off with control plane audit logs, making sure that you have kind of the picture of the administration of the cloud environment, CloudTrail logs, audit logs, activity logs, things like that. These are generally enabled by default, and the reason we bring that up is when we talk about that data plane logging, logs for activity in and on a specific resource within the cloud. These are the ones that generally need to be enabled and configured. And so when we do our incident response investigations, a lot of the time we see logs that are required to do a full investigation haven't necessarily been enabled and configured and centralized. Lastly, around kind of correlation opportunities between control plane, data plane, and the cloud, but also that on-premise component as well. And so if we end up in an incident response scenario that has an on-prem component and a cloud component, do we have the ability to collect those logs, centralize those logs, but also alert and detect on movement between each environment? And so with that, I'll pass it back over to Omar for the secure identities portion.
Awesome, thank you, Will. And before I dig into the identity pillar, I'd like to bring up an interesting statistic. Within Q1 of 2023, more than 60% of cloud compromises originated from some sort of an identity compromise, such as a brute force of an account with weak or no password, phishing attacks, or leaked credentials. So from the frontline perspective, what are the common challenges that we see as it relates to identity? One, lack of tiering and separation. We often see organizations using their on-prem IDP, commonly Active Directory, to administer and manage their on-prem environment as well as their cloud environment. And oftentimes, that Active Directory environment is based on legacy architecture and setup, essentially a flat domain. What that creates is a massive risk vector, where now identities that are based on on-prem Active Directory, once and if compromised, attackers are able to use those same credentials to log into cloud directly. The second challenge that I want to bring up covers an excessive scope of privileged identities. A lot of organizations have moved fast to cloud, have migrated a lot of workloads, and they defaulted to using the default roles across the cloud service providers. Oftentimes, we see organizations handing over highly privileged roles that are default to their infrastructure as well as to the developer teams. In AWS, we see them handing over the administrator role. In Azure, we see them handing over the global admin role. And in GCP, we see them use basic roles, such as editor, for example. Editor is an interesting role, where if you look at the permissions associated with that role, you'll see it has more than 4,000 overlapping permissions. And the third challenge I want to mention covers multi-factor authentication. It's not just the MFA method that we're enforcing. The area that oftentimes organizations overlook is the operational aspect of MFA. From where my users can register devices. How many devices can a single user have, for example? We'll touch on those throughout our IR studies. Let's start with our first IR case study under this pillar, attacking daily driver account. In this IR case study, we're dealing with an APT threat actor. Reminder, APT, those are highly technical in nature. And what we saw here is that threat actor using credentials, stolen credentials, to log into a single-factor VPN. Once they access the VPN, they started moving laterally on-prem within the on-prem network, and as they were progressing and accessing different systems, they were installing RATs, or remote access tools. This is a common attack technique that we see threat actors use to maintain persistence of it within an environment. Eventually, they were able to get to a domain controller, and once they got to a domain controller, they dumped and exfiltrated the Active Directory database, also known as the ntds.dit. What's interesting over here is that threat actor, once they exfiltrated the NTDS, they came back within 24 hours using accounts that they have compromised from the NTDS or the Active Directory database. And they used those accounts to log in directly into Azure AD. And the account that they used had global administrator role within Azure AD. Once they got into Azure AD, the next logical step was to perform recon, understand the lay of the land, understand the different security settings within the org's tenant. They started modifying certain settings, and eventually they were able to complete their mission, which is the exfiltration of highly privileged data set. So what are the key takeaways from this IR case study? One, the use of distinct and segregated identities for administrative functions, especially when it comes to cloud. Cloud administrators should be using cloud-only accounts that are not managed and not synced to on-prem Active Directory or on-prem IDP. Administrator accounts should be distinct and separate from the daily driver account, meaning the daily driver that every end user uses to log into email to conduct their day-to-day job. Administrator accounts should only be used to perform administrative functions. In addition, implementing just-in-time check-in, check-out enforcement model with access approval requirement. What that means is that with a just-in-time access model, a privileged account is only privileged for a finite duration of time, only when they need to perform administrative functions. Off hours, on weekends, on holidays, that account would no longer be administrative or would not have any privileged roles. Additionally, some cloud service providers across the board offer some sort of a privileged identity management that offers that capability. But we've also seen organizations deploy successfully a privileged access management, or a PAM solution for short, that offers that same functionality. The third takeaway I want to touch on is the use of a privileged access workstation. The use of a privileged access station would allow the organization to restrict access to cloud consoles as well as admin portals. The benefit of a PAW is that it introduces a barrier between your everyday endpoints being compromised and administrative endpoints. A successfully implemented PAW would be segmented, isolated, with limited access to the internet. One key benefit I want to bring to the table as it relates to PAW is that if you restrict access to and from cloud consoles as well as administrative portals, and an attacker is able to compromise a privileged identity, they would also have to compromise the privileged access workstation in order to be able to successfully authenticate and log in to a cloud console or an admin portal. And lastly, the use of some sort of a multi-admin approval capability. A multi-admin approval capability would prevent one admin from conducting massive changes within an infrastructure or within an admin portal. One admin can initiate or request the change, but it has to be approved by a secondary admin. We're seeing right now that vendors, as well as cloud service providers, are offering some sort of a multi-admin approval functionality, but even if the vendor or cloud provider does not offer that functionality, you could implement this using roles across the major cloud service providers. Okay, so we talked about identity, we talked about weak identity controls and how threat actors abuse it. Now let's shift gears and talk through MFA. There's a lot of MFA methods. There's a lot of attack techniques against MFA, but let's touch on the most common two MFA attack techniques. First and foremost is MFA fatigue, which targets primarily MFA push notification as a method, where this attack technique is commonly used by all threat actors, ungroups, APT, as well as FIN. where we see them target users and send the user within a short span of time. So let's say 50 MFA requests on their phone within a span of 2 minutes. Threat actors are going through that attack path because they're exploiting the user's frustration as well as their desire to stop receiving notifications on their phone. Users, especially non-technical users or folks within cyberspace, end up accepting MFA requests, granting the threat actor access. Again, very, very common attack technique conducted by most threat actors. The second MFA attack technique that we see threat actors use is adversary in the middle, or AITM for short. That one is more interesting because we see threat actors register domains that look like the organization domain with a small difference. For example, the organization-sso.com. They then use those domains and to send it out to users in a link. That can be through email, that can be through SMS. And once the user clicks on that link, it sends them to a login portal where a user would enter their username, their password, go through the MFA challenge, and once they follow that successfully, all that data set goes back to the threat actor's infrastructure, allowing them access and allowing them, even worse, to register their own MFA method. Okay, so we talked about common MFA attack techniques. Now, let's talk through the different commonly used MFA methods out there. The most common MFA methods we see organizations use are email, SMS, phone call, or push notification. Those are the easiest MFA methods to scale, to deploy across your end users. However, from a security perspective, those MFA methods are vulnerable to most MFA attack techniques, such as SIM swap, phishing, or adversary in the middle. We saw vendors pushing towards more secure MFA method, and that's where we saw the introduction of TOTP, or time-based one-time password MFA, where a user would have an MFA application on their phone, they would log into it, there's an MFA code that gets regenerated every 60 seconds, for example. Much, much more secure MFA method than the first batch. However, with successful phishing and social engineering attacks, we're seeing end users fall for it and providing threat actor the MFA code. So we now have context matching or number matching, which provides additional data set to allow the user to determine the legitimacy of that MFA prompt on their phone. Additional data set can be the login IP address, the location where the login is attempting from, or even the application the user is attempting to access. Yet again, with successful social engineering, users do fall for it. So what MFA method is secure, provides additional layer of protection, and is resilient against the common MFA method attack techniques? There's a handful of phishing-resistant MFA methods. The one I want to emphasize is FIDO2 hardware keys. FIDO is a much more secure MFA method. It offers enhanced security and is resilient to the common MFA attack techniques that we walked through so far. Saying that, the key caveat with FIDO is that rolling out FIDO at scale becomes much more difficult given that you have to physically ship hardware keys to your end users. So how can we protect our MFA infrastructure holistically? Let's talk through some takeaways. One, enforcing phishing-resistant MFA for all users. Yet again, we just talked about how difficult it is given that you have to ship the hardware keys to your end users. At a bare minimum, enforcing FIDO or phishing-resistant MFA for highly privileged users as well as your high-value targets. Two, restricting the MFA enrollment process. Whereas for end users to register or add an MFA method, they have to be physically located within a trusted network location, your corporate office, for example. And if that's not feasible or scalable, then the second option can be that they have to call the help desk, go through a video verification process, show their face, show their ID, and once they pass that verification process, they're allowed to register a new MFA method. any changes to MFA should be recorded, should be logged, and should be reacted upon. That encompasses MFA additions, removals, and any modifications. And lastly, this last bullet point hits on the endpoints themselves, not their mobile devices, whereas in endpoints, we want to add additional constraints to protect against session relay attacks, where we see threat actors compromising an endpoint, stealing the tokens on that endpoint, and using them on their infrastructure to gain access to resources. To protect against that, we want to restrict devices accessing resources and applications and admin consoles so that they have to be compliant with the organizational policies, meaning they have your security stack, they have your EDR tools. 2, they're joined to your domain. And lastly, we restrict the livelihood of the session token so that even if the token is stolen, it would only be valid for X number of hours or days and not the default setting, which in some cases can be more than 90 days. And with that, I'll hand it over to Will to go through the last pillar, reducing your attack surface.
All right, awesome. Awesome, so we'll get into reduce your attack surface, starting off similar to the other pillars with some common challenges. And so when we talk about attack surface in the cloud, I think the one thing we want to focus on here is making sure that you have the ability to see your own environment as attackers can externally. And so one common challenge that we see organizations face is that attack surface isn't necessarily just network focused when we talk about the cloud. That being said, publicly exposed resources are still a very common cause of cloud compromise. And we'll get into some examples in the IR case studies of how these are still occurring. The second piece is kind of around tenant enumeration, in that attack surface can also include what an attacker can enumerate about your environment, things like the identities that exist within it, security configurations, settings, resource configurations, things like that. And then lastly, we're including keys and credentials as part of the attack surface, like long-lived service account keys, user credentials that can be mistakenly published to public code repositories, uploaded to SharePoint, uploaded to Google Drive, other insecure locations like that. And so we'll go through another IR example that covers those credentials as well. And so we'll break down each of those that we just talked about, starting off with publicly exposed resources. And so when we think about cloud compromise, this is probably the one that makes the most headlines over the years in terms of a public S3 bucket, a public storage account that gets an attacker is able to identify that, exfiltrate data from that organization. And so cloud providers have done a lot to make it more difficult to inadvertently expose these to the public. But we're still seeing this as a common challenge worth bringing up here, both from the perspective of that infrastructure as a service, usually virtual machines that are exposed from a network perspective, and also from the platform as a service, those storage accounts, database services, API endpoints that with sometimes one misconfiguration, one setting can be exposed to the internet. And so we'll get into another IR example that kind of goes through how these continue to occur. In this case, we had an organization looking to set up a sensitive build server within their cloud environment as a virtual machine. And so given the sensitivity of that virtual machine, they wanted to put it behind a reverse proxy that only accepted connections from their on-premise data center. So that's great. It's not exposed to the internet. It's only accepting connections from known IPs. At the same time as they're setting it up, they also attached an elastic IP. Not a huge deal because, as you can see in the security group associated with it, still only accepting connections from that reverse proxy, which is only accepting connections from the on-premise data center. Now, in a story I'm sure a lot of people have seen before, during the course of testing, an administrator is working from home and wants to access that build server. So they update the security group, just temporarily in this case, to allow access from the internet and bypass that reverse proxy that's out in front. And so like we talked about, attackers are continuously scanning for virtual machines that are exposed to the internet. In this case, this one is accessible from the internet, has a public IP associated with it. And so an attacker over the course of a few days was able to identify this virtual machine, brute force their way onto it, and eventually access the sensitive data credentials that were on this VM and then eventually extort this specific organization. And so we'll kind of talk through, there's tools that are available, both that we see attackers taking advantage of, and also, our internal red teams that can help to identify this attack surface, both from the perspective of public exposure across the three, major cloud providers, virtual machines that are exposed, platform as a service, infrastructure that's exposed, different tools that can do that, but also from the perspective of if an attacker has read-only or low-privileged access within your cloud environment, there's tools available to enumerate data about that tenant, enumerate credentials that might live within the cloud environment as a way for the attacker to identify those and then be able to escalate privileges. So really, making sure that you have, using the tools, have that perspective of what an attacker can see externally from your environment. And so cloud security posture management, great way to help out with that in terms of it has a lot of really valuable components to it when we're talking about cloud security. For this one specifically, we're thinking more from the inventory perspective in terms of identifying what should be publicly exposed and then being able to alert and remediate anything that gets inadvertently. So if we talk about that IR example, setting that security group to allow access from the internet should have immediately set off alarm bells, had an incident response process associated with it to go and remediate that. Another great way to help identify those kind of externally exposed resources from a network perspective would be something like an external attack surface management scanning tool. Given a set of public IP addresses, being able to identify what resources are available, what software is running on them, any vulnerabilities associated with those, and kind of get the idea of any entry points into the environment. So those are kind of the network aspect. The last two are a little bit different in terms of monitoring social media and dark web for kind of targeted keywords about your organization. Things like chatter on the dark web about user credentials that have been compromised, data that's been compromised, potential vulnerabilities. And also, like Omar mentioned, domain registrations that are similar to your organization and kind of having a process to identify those and have a takedown process for those domains as well. And then lastly, proactively scanning for credentials that may live in code repositories or file shares, places like that, but also within cloud environments itself. And so think like function variables could have secrets and credentials that live with them. Infrastructure as code templates, startup scripts for virtual machines. All these places that if an attacker is able to get low privileged or read-only access within your cloud environment, they'll start scanning for and identifying these credentials that can live as a way to escalate privileges. So on that point of credential scanning, we'll get into the last IR example around a service account credential leaking, leading to crypto mining. So in this case, we had a GCP service account that was created with owner permissions. So right off the bat, overprivileged. We know some of the takeaways from that. This credential associated with that service account was inadvertently uploaded to a public code repository. And for this organization, actually, within GCP, they had Security Command Center running and actually identified that that service account key had been uploaded to a public code repository. They received an alert. It said, this credential for this service account with these privileges has been uploaded to this code repository. Go take it down. Unfortunately for this organization, they were not actively monitoring these alerts from their out-of-the-box tools, and so this one went unnoticed for a number of days. And so eventually, an attacker was able to identify this credential, enumerate what they had access to, realize they had the ability to spin up new virtual machines, and so they did that across a number of regions, set up internet connectivity, and then were able to deploy that crypto mining software across the GCP projects. What did eventually tip off this organization was not the alerts from the out-of-box tools, but it was the cost anomaly and the billing associated with that project. So we'll get into some takeaways to finish up this section. More around protecting service accounts and those credentials. So really reducing the need and identifying where possible, we can move from those long-lived service account credentials and moving towards short-term credentials. Things like AWS using roles instead of IAM users, GCP using workload identity federation instead of service accounts. Azure using managed identities instead of service principals, things like that. If still required, having those service accounts, make sure that there's an inventory and audit of how they're being used. Things like who's the owner of that service account, what does the service account do, what are the dependencies if it is compromised and we have to go and rotate it, making sure that that's documented in either within the cloud provider or externally somewhere. Third area around limiting the scope of service accounts. So a service account shouldn't have owner permissions assigned to it, but really just kind of using the tools that are available to identify which permissions are required for those accounts, and then applying those as required. And obviously this one's kind of easier said than done, but we do see it provide a lot of value as it relates to those incident response examples. And then lastly, make sure we're monitoring those out-of-the-box tools and developing custom detections if possible to be able to identify anomalous usage of our service accounts and user credentials, things like that. And then having a process to identify those, take those alerts, and then have a response plan and playbook to go and remediate those using the information that we talked about on those first three. Awesome. And so with that, I'll pass it back over to Omar to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. All right, folks, let's wrap up. OK, so we talked about three main pillars or themes. One is securing your hybrid architecture, understanding your integrations between on-prem and cloud environments and how attackers can abuse those integrations to compromise and abuse your cloud environments. Two, segmenting and securing your identities and accounts. Accounts are not created equal, so should the security enforcement that we have on accounts. And lastly, the third one on attack surface. Every organization should have the high ground compared to a threat actor, given that you should know your infrastructure and your identities better than a threat actor. Expanding your attack surface scope to encompass identity and not just network will give you a better understanding of what could occur or what could a non-privileged user view across your infrastructure and across your environment. Throughout this session, we presented incidents in a linear approach. I want to reiterate and bring up that incidents are not linear. They're much more dynamic in nature and encompass multiple levels across your infrastructure and across your organization. Your security program and initiatives should comprehensively encompass on-prem, cloud environments, and every integration in between. And with that, thank you all, and thanks for joining us.